Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joseph Dresden. I'm a senior program associate at the Kennan Institute. I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon to discuss the implication of Belarus's involvement in Russia's invasion of Ukraine for regional security, as well as for Belarus's relations with Russia and the West. I encourage you to stay up to date on the latest Kennan Institute events and publications by visiting our website and subscribing to our two blogs, Focus Ukraine and the Russia File, as well as our podcasts, Kennan X and the Russia File. Visit our Hindsight Upfront Ukraine collection page on the Wilson Center for the latest news and analysis focused on Ukraine. I'd like to ask our audience that if you have a question during the course of this conversation, you can submit that via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page at any time. Please include your name and affiliation when you send your questions. Now, let me begin by introducing our speakers and allow them an opportunity to describe their own work. Our first speaker today is Dr. Alla Lukavets. Alla is a George F. Kennan Fellow at the Kennan Institute. She specializes in the domestic and foreign policy of Belarus and other Eastern Partnership countries, as well as being in elections and electoral protests in non-democratic regimes. She holds a PhD in political science from Brennan International Graduate School of Social Sciences in Germany, focusing on integration policies of Belarus and Ukraine vis-a-vis the EU and Russia. In addition, she has recently finished her postdoctoral programs in electoral studies at the University of Tartu in Estonia and at the University of Leipzig in Germany, as well as completed several research stays and traineeships inter alia at the Harvard David Center, European Parliament in Belarus, and the UK Parliament in London. Alla, look forward to your remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be part of this panel discussion, and many thanks to the Kennan Institute and to the office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya for organizing it. In my opening statement, I would like to focus on three main things. First, I would like to discuss how Lukashenko has assisted Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Second, why he has done it. And finally, I would like to discuss the implications of the war in Ukraine for the stability and durability of authoritarian regime in Belarus. So Lukashenko has played a crucial role in enabling Russia's aggression of Ukraine. Leading up to the invasion, he hosted Russian troops and military equipment on Belarusian territory. He allowed the Kremlin to use Belarus as a launching pad for its attack on Ukraine, and subsequently adopted constitutional amendments which revoked Belarus's official stance of neutrality and its nuclear-free status. Although Belarus has not yet been directly involved in the war, recent developments indicate that Lukashenko might be making steps in this direction, and his room for maneuver, or his options to avoid such a scenario, are narrowing. Over May and June this year, there has been an increase in military activity along Belarus-Ukraine border. On the 7th of June, the Belarusian Ministry of Defense declared the start of training on the transition from peacetime to wartime. Lukashenko has reportedly decided to expand the country's military forces from 65,000 to 80,000. And as we speak, the Belarusian military is holding mobilization training exercises on the border with Ukraine, which were extended beyond the 1st of July until the 9th of July. Lukashenko is also fully supporting Russia in its recent argument with Lithuania over the blockade of sanctioned goods transiting through the territory of Belarus to Kaliningrad. Lukashenko called Lithuania's actions the declaration of war on Russia, which deserve an adequate response. And during the most recent meeting between Putin and Lukashenko, which took place at the end of June, Putin confirmed that Russia would soon transfer to Belarus tactical missile systems capable of carrying nuclear warheads in order to withstand Western pressure. It is important to underline that Lukashenko has not always been so supportive of Russia's expansionist policy in Ukraine, and his discourse on this issue, in fact, has changed drastically over the last 2 years. At the time of the Maidan revolution in Ukraine in 2014, when Russia started its military aggression and annexed Crimea, Lukashenko acted as a mediator and a peacemaker in the crisis. Belarus became a platform for international talks to resolve the 2014 crisis in Ukraine, and the West highly praised the role of Lukashenka in this process. Diplomatic contacts with Minsk intensified, and the EU lifted sanctions from the Belarusian regime in February 2016. However, the situation is drastically different now. And in order to understand why Lukashenka is supporting Putin in the current war, it's important to take a short retrospect, to look back at the key turning point in Belarus-Russia relations. This moment came in August 2020, when Lukashenko declared a victory in the controversial presidential election, and massive protests erupted all over Belarus, which put into question the stability of the Belarusian dictatorship. When Lukashenko faced the biggest popular challenge in his 26 years of rule, he turned to the Kremlin for help. And since then, his dependence on Russia has grown tremendously, while his room for maneuver on the international stage narrowed dramatically due to comprehensive Western sanctions. By 2022, Belarus has largely turned into a puppet state and an extension of Russia's territory. So what implications does the war in Ukraine have for the durability of Lukashenko's regime? There are three main points to make here. First, the war in Ukraine has become an ultimate test for Lukashenko's loyalty to Putin, and he is ready to provide significant concessions to the Kremlin to ensure his own survival. That means that the threat of incorporation of Belarus by Russia on Russia's terms is becoming a reality. During the most recent meeting between Lukashenko and Putin, to which I have already referred earlier, Putin emphasized that there is an urgent need for closer unification between Belarus and Russia due to unprecedented Western pressure. So in the short-term perspective, we can expect more statements along these lines and possibly more concrete steps in this direction, which can lead to further limitations on Belarus's sovereignty. The second main aspect of this question is how the war in Ukraine is perceived by the citizens of Belarus. First of all, according to the most recent opinion polls, over 80% of the general public in Belarus are against deeper involvement of their country in the Ukraine's crisis. Even more importantly, anti-war sentiments are also present among Belarusian elites. There were already several resignations of high officials in Belarus several months ago, and the most recent development concerning the moods of elites regarding the war happened at the beginning of July, when a group of senior military officers in a special forces unit in Belarus, with ranks from captain to colonel, reportedly signed an open letter to Lukashenko speaking against potential Belarusian participation in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. These developments indicate that Lukashenko might face a domestic backlash in the case of full-scale involvement of Belarusian forces in the Russia-Ukraine war. The third point is that the war in Ukraine has a chance to increase the importance of the influence of the Belarusian democratic forces. As a result of the war, they have the opportunity to gain even more international space and continue portraying Lukashenko as a threat to international peace and security. It's also a great chance for the democratic forces of Belarus to keep lobbying the West for sustained economic and political pressure, which would deprive Lukashenko of the resources to continue repressions inside Belarus and go on with supporting Russia in the war. In conclusion, I would like to say that overall, Lukashenko's power has been weakened by the ongoing developments in Ukraine. He ultimately finds himself in a no-win situation. On the one hand, Russia continues to tighten its grip around him, and on the other hand, he continues to face the domestic legitimacy crisis and very strong international democratizing pressure. The outcome of the war in Ukraine will be crucial for the future of democratic Belarus, and I think it's very important that the West should keep supporting the democratic Belarusian movement and continue to penalize the Lukashenko regime for the vital role it has played in enabling Russia's aggression in the region. On this note, I would like to finish, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alla. Our next speaker is Valery Kovalyevsky. Valery is Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's representative on foreign affairs and head of cabinet. He currently works out of Kiev. He establishes relations, formulates foreign policy priorities, implements agreements, and develops international engagements to realize democratic change in Belarus. His professional background includes a national diplomatic service with specialization on bilateral relations with the US and human rights and intergovernmental organizations. Prior to joining Tikhanovskaya's team, Kovalyevsky worked in the World Bank Group in Washington, D.C. He holds degrees from Belarus State University, Kosminsky Academy, and Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Valery, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you very much for inviting me here to be part of this discussion. Thanks to the Kennan Institute for joining the office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya in organizing this conversation about such an important topic. So I would like to echo the introduction from Alla, saying that Lukashenka is the person who has started this war, without whom this war would not be possible. It is absolutely clear that the thrust of the offense from Russia in the early stage of the war was on Kiev. That was the ultimate trophy for Russians, and only through Belarus it was possible to reach that objective. At the same time, while Lukashenka has put the relations between Belarusian and the Ukrainian people at such peril, he has betrayed the trust of the Ukrainian people, violated multiple international norms. He has also put in jeopardy the very existence of Belarus. The presence of Russian forces on the ground in Belarus is a clear and present danger to our national interests. This is not something that has been mandated by Belarusians. Lukashenka has lost legitimacy in 2020. And when he makes decisions like this, he acts either in the interest of the Kremlin or in his personal interest, which is to regain power. But by now, what we have is that Belarus is de facto partially occupied by Russia. Which comes on top of the domestic occupation by Lukashenka since 2020, when Belarusian people have been deprived of the right to speak, to express their political views, and to be part of the political process in our country. Now we have Russian forces all around, and this significantly complicates the task of achieving democratic change and transition in Belarus. As for the relations between Belarus and Ukraine, I would sort of very conditionally divide them in two big parts, kind of uneven parts. People-to-people relations have always been good between Belarusians and Ukrainians, very warm, very welcoming, very close cultures, close languages, and the history that connects us through centuries. And after the start of the war, Belarusians have turned from sort of victims of oppression and mass repressions in Belarus into actually co-aggressors against Ukrainian people. So at the moment, those who have stayed in Ukraine, who have not fled the war, they're facing a barrage of complicated challenges. On migration, on bank accounts, on mistreatment, and the wave of this sort of negative attitude to Belarusians has subsided somewhat in recent weeks, but nevertheless, we also see that this is a subject of manipulations, essentially by the propaganda, by the hostile forces, willing to split Belarusian and Ukrainian people. Second part of this equation is state-to-state relations. And for a very long time, we have seen that Belarus and Ukraine have been kind of seeing each other with some suspicion. There was a sense of competition. Since 1991, when we regained independence, it was clear that Ukraine and Belarus competed for the attention of Russia because of the subsidies, because of the access to markets, because of the energy prices. That's why we can see that we have met the beginning of the war with both countries being sort of in rather lukewarm relations, which lasted for quite some time. At the same time, the relations have significantly deteriorated, of course. Lukashenko has not been recognized even before the war as legitimate president, but still Kiev is sort of holding the ground. They are not willing to provide Minsk with any pretext to engage in the war in a more full-scale form. As if before that was something that has stopped Lukashenko or Putin from attacking Ukraine. But all in all, this break in the relations, not only diplomatic relations have remained intact, but this breakage in relations has been rather painful to Belarus as well, because 14% of the external trade from Belarus was for Ukraine. Now this part is missing in the economy. So what comes next in this equation? The question is if Ukraine can feel safe with Lukashenko around, and we assert that it is impossible to imagine that Ukraine is free and independent and prosperous, and its peace is sustainable if Lukashenko is still around, if he still controls Belarus while being under control of Putin. He has clearly shown that he has become a threat to international peace and security. His entire 2021 was devoted to that. The seizure of the Ryanair flight, the migration crisis, and then participation in the CSTO operation in Kazakhstan has shown that he has been willing to pass really significant red lines. For many years, Lukashenko has been very careful not to attract too much attention from the international community. Just harassing his own people was not good enough for the international community to seriously interfere in the situation in Belarus. Now he has crossed this line, and now he deserves all the attention from the international community on what he is doing. The big part of the process of today is relations between Putin and Lukashenko. Lukashenko seems to be giving away a lot of ground to Putin these days. Even in the early 2021, there were some proclamations from Lukashenko and his people that Belarus is willing to give up on its non-nuclear status, on its neutrality status. And I would argue that those were early signs that Lukashenko was informed about the plans of Putin to go with war against Ukraine. And those were the steps to prepare for this operation. By now, Lukashenko has adopted the constitution, which is not legal and not recognized, but still it removes these legal barriers to deployment of conventional forces from Russia in Belarus and nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus, which definitely must be of concern to all. And we've already seen some signs that Putin is willing to pass some delivery systems to Lukashenko, which is a clear violation of the constitution of Belarus and also treaty on non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. What concerns Ukrainians right now is whether there will be an escalation of participation from Lukashenko in this war. He has been part of this war from the day one and until now, sort of being in a passive-aggressive mode, running these drills and exercises and maintaining really high hostile rhetoric towards Ukraine. But the question that concerns everybody, if Lukashenko will finally kind of send Belarusian troops for combat operations in Ukraine. And there are conflicting signals from him, but the premise is that he has been part of this war and he is willing to remain part of this war. And sooner or later, it might happen that he would send the troops to Belarus. and that will become a make it or break it moment for Ukraine, for democratic forces of Belarus, but also for the future of the regional security. That might be the moment when Kyiv abandons its caution in dealing with the democratic forces of Belarus and finally steps up its engagement in Belarus, understanding that it is the democratic Belarus that would be the guarantee against the repetition of the scenario when Russia uses the territory of Belarus against Ukraine. Inevitably, this whole situation puts a question before all Belarusians on geopolitical choice, like whether we're willing to continue the same relations with Russia that is hostile, that is aggressive, that dismisses all kinds of international norms, which disrespects our sovereign independence and also identity, national identity. That's why democratic forces of Belarus and Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's office in particular were running this campaign to make sure that the European Union recognizes a European perspective for Belarus while considering the candidacies of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia last month, and we have to say that we have reached this point. European Parliament in its resolution mentioned a European perspective for Belarus, but also European Council final document has been also mentioning Belarus and the right of Belarusian people for free and fair elections. And finally, I would like to conclude with one specific area in which we have worked a lot until recently and quite progressed. This is in the Council of Europe, again, demonstrating the leaning of Belarus to a European choice. There's an opportunity now to formalize relations between the Belarusian people and the Council of Europe in order to prepare the country for building up a new democratic Belarus. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Valeria. Next, we have Dr. Yelena Korsalyova. Yelena is a professor and director of the Institute for Global Sustainable Development at the University of Warwick. She's also co-founder and visiting professor at Oxford Belarus Observatory. Before joining the IGSD in 2022, she was professor of international politics and director of the Global Europe Center Professional Studies at the University of Kent for 10 years. Her research focus is on sustainable communities from a resilience and complexity thinking perspectives across Eastern Europe and Central Eurasia. Her recent GCRF Compass project focused on capacity building for sustainable development and was highly recommended by the Times Higher Education under the category of Best International Collaboration of the Year in 2021. Yelena, we look forward to your remarks.
Hello, and good afternoon from the UK, and thank you very much for the invitation here. It has been very difficult, to be honest, to prepare for this presentation because obviously a lot of ground has been already covered, a lot has been said, and I'm here really just to reiterate the tragic state of affairs related to the continued loss of human lives in Ukraine and the worsening situation in Belarus as well, and the fact that Belarus at the moment, Belarus regime is rewriting its own future. There are 3 points I wish to make in particular, but actually, yet again, a lot of what I'm going to say has been already partially mentioned by both Alla and Valeria. So first of all, I would like to focus on very briefly on what I call an unrecoverable shift from neutrality and the near genocide and being a near genocide victim of the Second World War to now being formally recognized as a threat in the recent NATO summit in Madrid. And basically being associated now with Russia as a war complex and aggressor. So that's where Belarus is at the moment in its international perception. And I have to say here that it is really tragic that what we see now is that, that with a stroke of a pen, Lukashenka is now rewriting not just the past, but also the future of the nation, whose name is now smeared and forever will be associated with the aggressor and with the atrocities that are currently happening in Ukraine and around in Ukraine. And also, just think about the scale and the burden of responsibilities for these war crimes that are going to be placed on the shoulders of many, many generations to come. This is kind of the emotional reflection. And, you know, in, for example, even in when I communicate with my colleagues, it is very interesting from the region that we tend to now either communicate in English or in Belarusian, simply because Russian is no longer acceptable for this kind of discussions, because it's too traumatic for people to communicate now in Russian. But the pragmatic point here, talking about the shift from neutrality to being recognized as a war conflict, is the fact that it has serious implications for the security situation in Europe and globally. And Valer already referred to that, to this point, but the fact that the principle of neutrality and the intention to be precisely to be free of nuclear weapons, especially in light of the, you know, in the context of Chernobyl tragedy back in 1980s, it just formed that kind of narrative, official narrative, on the foundation of the security policy in Belarus in early 90s. And it was introduced in the Declaration of Sovereignty, but also the principle was also confirmed in the Constitution itself. Back in and adopted, confirmed by the Belarusian Supreme Soviet on the 15th of March 1994. But this very principle, though, was then altered by the so-called constitutional referendum and amendments to the Constitution back in 2021. And obviously, in further actions by Lukashenka, they clearly violated not just the neutrality status of the country, but its future security as well. And what we specifically refer here to is the fact that we're not just simply talking about military presence or foreign forces on the territory of Belarus. We also talk, and Valer again mentioned it already, about the request of Lukashenka on the 25th of June to transfer Iskander missiles to which actually can carry both conventional and nuclear warheads to Belarus, and also requesting to upgrade Belarusian Su-25 fighters to carry nuclear weapons, to which obviously Putin granted permission. But what is, I think, the consequence of which is now that not only Belarus is mentioned now in the declaration, NATO's declaration of this threat, but also there is a real prospect of NATO revoking the so-called 3 no's, which was the basis for NATO-Russia founding act in response to this action. And this was clearly mentioned in Article 4 of this founding act that states that NATO members, that stated clearly that NATO members have no intention, no plan, and no reason to deploy nuclear weapons on the territory of new members, nor any need to change any aspects of NATO's nuclear posture or nuclear policy. So if this were to be truly revisited in response to new developments between Belarus and Russia, then it clearly forms much greater danger that we saw back during the times of the Cold War, and a real prospect of all of this coming out of any possible control. That brings me to my second point, And my second point is about weaponization of Belarus dependencies on Russia, by Russia, and to Russia's needs. And that's clearly, on the one hand, it has been kind of instigated to a degree by the sanctions that have been applied by the West on Belarus. But at the same time, the fact that Russia unashamedly using this, its leverage and Belarus dependency, now full dependency on Russia to its own interests. So much so that it's not just in terms of economic dependencies. It's not just in terms of the survival of the regime and Lukashenka himself. It is first and foremost now about security and this kind of military absorption of Belarus by Russia, and in fact to such a degree that there is a threat. It has been discussed many times now by scholars that there is a threat of not just Belarus losing its independence, which I think it has been the case already, but also Belarus risking its sovereignty absorption by Russia and altogether disappearance as a nation state. So that's in terms of weaponization of dependencies by Russia. But I think there is a much bigger picture that we have to consider now in place. And that's, when back in a good few years ago, scholars began a discussion about, the change, contestation to the international liberal order, and the fact that there are shifts within the governance of international liberal order and so on. What we see now, actually, as a matter of fact, is not just the becoming, it's the arrival of the multi-order world. And this multi-order world seems to be far more kind of hostile and uncooperative. And to such a degree that we can't even start comprehending how to, for us as the world, to be ready for the arrival of this multi-order world. So we're not ready, not just simply in terms of leverage, in terms of how to accept the arrival of multi-order world, where Russia is has clearly positioned itself as hostile, and it tends to kind of bring other states around itself in terms of foreseeing that specific order. Not only we are no longer have the same mechanisms that we had before in terms of trying to procure some dialogue and ensure diplomacy. There are no institutions that are kind of more or less that effective in helping us to achieve some form of compromise on the international stage. But even more so, those promises of delivering peace and security for all, yet again, they're no longer there in terms of securing that future. And the statement and the declaration that NATO recently took, it actually testifies to the fact that we are allowing things to spiral out of control. But what is the other alternative? And that's the bigger question for all of us to answer. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Our final speaker today is Franek Viachorka. Franek is a senior advisor to Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. He's also a journalist from Belarus. He previously worked as a research and media analyst for the U.S. Agency for Global Media as a contractor focusing on Eurasia's digital markets. He has served as a creative director for Belarus Service of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, RFERL, vice president for the Digital Communication Network, consultant for Freedom House, and the Broadcasting Board of Governors. Viachorka is a frequent speaker and an advocate for democracy and personal freedom, for his activism and journalism work in Belarus. He was jailed multiple times by the Belarusian government, but he is with us today from a very sunny place. Franek, we look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Greetings from Vilnius, a very sunny place, capital of Lithuania, just not far from Belarus border, where many Belarusian journalists, activists, political leaders moved after the crackdown in 2020. So my colleagues already mentioned all the major aspects regarding Belarus participation in the war. I would like to mention or to repeat 5 of them. First of all, Belarus as the preface of war. Second, Belarus as a strategic territory for Russia and for Putin. Third, Lukashenka as enabler and complicit. Fourth, Belarusians as strategic Ukrainian allies. And fifth, Belarus as the part of the solution. And let me stop on each of these aspects. First of all, Belarus is the preface of war. I think it's evident already that without control over Belarus, Putin would not try blitzkrieg in February 2022. And the preparation to this war started not by deploying troops on the Russian-Ukrainian border. It started much earlier in 2021 by destroyal of civil society, by imprisoning all alternative voices. So Belarusian society would not be able to resist the use of its territory. And if back then in 2020, 2021, the international community, the European Union, would be more active, would be braver, would be firmer, perhaps the situation would be much different right now. Second aspect, Belarus is a strategic land. So it's not a strategic territory for Russia. It's not only about the possibility to reach Kiev in a few hours from Belarus territory. This was exactly the goal on February 24, when Russian tanks moved to Ukraine early morning. But also Belarus enables Putin's offensive towards the possible Suwalki Gap. Right now, I think it's Politico who named the most dangerous place in the world, the Suwalki Gap, the short piece of land between Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus, which connects Belarus with Kaliningrad region. And without control over Belarus, for Putin, this sort of operation would not be possible. For Putin, Belarus is strategically important also for placing missiles, not only nuclear missiles, but also regular missiles, long-range missiles. And today there was a news early this day about the beginning of construction of the missiles based on the Belarus territory. It's not confirmed yet, but it's very possible that it's true. Third point, Lukashenka as enabler. So basically, Lukashenka became complicit. Lukashenka gave up the sovereignty of Belarus, as my colleague Valer Kovalevsky has mentioned. To compare with historical events, Lukashenka can be compared with Petain and occupied France, as a collaborator government serving primarily the interest of the capital. In case of France, it was Vichy's government serving Berlin. In case of Belarus, Lukashenko serving Moscow. But definitely, he doesn't have any sovereignty in decision making here. Lukashenko had to pay out the debt for Putin's support in 2020, 2021. But also for Lukashenko, this is the final battle. He understands that his officers, his clique, will unite around him only in case if Putin supports him. And all these visits that Allah has mentioned in the beginning, all these visits to Moscow, they are on one hand, of course, for asking money, for some political advantages, but also the goal of this visit is to demonstrate to loyalists that Putin is standing behind Lukashenko. The fourth, Belarusians and strategic Ukrainian allies. This is something we often neglect or underestimate, but in this war, Belarusian people, and it's not a small country, it's 9 million, people nation, Belarusian can help Ukrainians to win. And the partisan activities in the beginning of the war in February, March, they basically helped somehow Ukrainian army, first of all, to monitor military activity on its border. Second, they slowed down the delivery of supplies, delivery of food to Russian troops that already crossed the border. And third, they basically destroyed the railway connection between Belarus and Ukraine, which possibly convinced Russian commanders to give up on the idea to attack from Belarus territory because the delivery was impossible through the railways. Also, we see in Belarus and the strong group of people, especially internet users, especially those who live in big cities, especially those who are in the south and watching missiles launched every day, they support Ukrainians a lot. They don't have tools, they don't have arms to organize armed resistance, but they definitely are big allies. And in case of escalation, they can play crucial role for Ukrainian army. Plus, you see that number of fighters in Belarusian battalions is increasing, and these battalions they showed not just bravery but also the high professionalism, and they are considered one of the most efficient in Ukrainian army, those battalions that are built with Belarusian fighters. And the very last point, Belarus is the part of the solution. It might be, but of course, without Lukashenka. We always repeat that Belarus and Ukraine are parts of the same problem. And this is what many Westerners don't understand. First of all, because of the nature of the crisis in Belarus and in Ukraine are similar. This is Russian revanchism primarily. Without Russian support, Lukashenko wouldn't be in power today. Second, the solution or the changes in Belarus can definitely weaken Putin a lot. We hear very often that, perhaps when Putin falls down, Belarus situation will change, Belarus crisis will be solved. But it also works vice versa. When changes in Belarus will start, it can be the crucial point in the crisis, in the conflict, which will weaken Putin a lot. Right now, Putin demonstrates Lukashenka is the exclusive and the most important ally. If he loses this ally, at some point, there will be also a huge hit on Putin's reputation and image within Russian society. Thank you. I will stop here.
Okay, thank you very much. A reminder to our audience, if you would like to ask a question to our panel, please submit it via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @KennanInstitute, or on our Facebook page at any time. Please do include your name and affiliation when sending your question. But I have a few questions of my own to start the discussion with. So my first one is, how closely coordinated is Russian and Belarusian TV these days? I know from Allah's writings that Russian journalists or Kremlin journalists played a key role in sustaining Lukashenko in power back during the post-election crisis. How coordinated are they to this day in sort of keeping the Belarusian population sort of misinformed, if you will, about what's going on actually in Ukraine these days?
I can start. I thought it's a question to Allah, but I can start. I can start from my perspective. So they coordinate the most important strategic political blocks of news. Basically, the main TV program every night, it repeats the Russian narrative. Also, they are buying or they're just receiving for free Russian programs, Russian TV shows. Since from 2014 to 2019 or 2020, Lukashenko avoided showing Russian TV programs, analytical programs on Belarusian television, and substituted them with their own production. But right now, we see again that Russian programs are back on Belarus TV, and it makes, first of all, Belarusians very susceptible to propaganda. It also, as we see, changes public opinion. Those who didn't have any clear position, whom to support, whom to favorize in the beginning of war, we see a slight increase of those who favorize Russia. This is a direct result of propaganda, and it's interesting that when we correlate the use, the watchers, the viewers of television with the support of Russian or Ukrainian position, we see clearly that those who receive the news from state television, prevailing majority supports Russian war, and those who receive news from internet, social media, they are prevalently support Ukraine, or at least have like clear anti-war stance. What does it mean for us? We need to establish, to develop a comprehensive strategy on restoring influence in the media space, because majority of independent media were destroyed or forced to leave the country right now. We have to work with digital influencers. For example, today, just a few hours ago, we had a call with the director of TikTok, Office of Tikhanovskaya. We spoke with them and we agreed on collaboration, which is quite cool, in order to help Belarusian creators who are in Belarus or who are in exile to be more visible in Belarus TikTok space. And we should work more with technological companies to make sure professional journalists, media outlets who were liquidated in Belarus and continue working in exile can restore their work as soon as possible. This will help us to not to prevail in the media space perhaps, but at least to restore some of control we lost after crackdown, in some of influence we lost in 2020 and 2021.
Franek, you should call it TikTok as you do it. Just free one. You can use it, royalty free. Alla, please.
Joseph, just really quickly. Sorry, I didn't realize the question was addressed.
It wasn't directly at you, but please.
Right.
Welcome your perspective.
Yeah, I would just like to reiterate Franek's point and say that, you know, Russians' penetration in the media space of Belarus is really high, and I think it has increased as a result of the war. And Russia is really spinning this narrative that this whole operation is a defensive operation, and its main goal is to protect both Russia and Belarus from the sort of Western aggression. I think Franek was right in mentioning that there was a certain influence on the so-called neutral part of the population, which started to favor Lukashenko. There was this recent study by Friedrich Ebert, which is called the Tracker of Belarusian Changes, which I invite everybody to take a look at, which says that there has been recently an increase in 10%, let's say, of people who support Lukashenko. This neutral part of the population has started to support him. But I would also like to say that the overwhelming majority of people, according to numerous opinion polls, remains very much against Belarusian deeper involvement in the crisis. And I would also like to especially, emphasize the role of this Telegram channel, Gayun. Gayun is a special spirit, the Belarusian spirit from the mythology, which sort of this Telegram channel aims to track all the military developments in Belarus, and it provides to people information what's actually happening on the ground. So there are sources of information which can provide Belarusians with what is really happening on the ground, and I hope that this will not lead to the drastic change in the opinion polls, and people will still be opposed to Belarusian deeper involvement in the Ukraine's crisis.
So I have one more question before turning to questions from the audience. Ali mentioned there is a widespread unpopularity for Russia's war in Ukraine, But is there any kind of pervasive fear that among Belarusians that they might be next? Maybe not by military means, but by fiat, by decision, but from Lukashenko, that soon they could stop being a sovereign state? Or do they even notice the difference that they're so under such control by Russians? Can you pull that out a little bit? Any of the panelists, this is a question for.
I'll try to answer that, or at least to begin to answer that. Well, actually, first I would like to make a correction. Anna, you mentioned a Ukrainian crisis. I would just suggest refrain from calling it Ukrainian crisis. I think it's war in Ukraine, because the crisis is totally something else. It hasn't been caused by Ukraine itself.
I totally agree with you, Yelena. Yeah, it was just maybe.
You slip. But I think it's important because very often, there is this confusion, and these terms are very often used interchangeably. But we need to be clear: there is a war, and there is humanitarian crisis there clearly. And in answer to your question, there are a lot of kind of anecdotal stories currently coming out of Belarus, in a sense that actually what seems to be happening is that Lukashenko is trying to provoke actually the kind of military involvement of Belarus in the war with Ukraine. For example, just yesterday, I think there were several explosions heard on the territory of Belarus, in the south territory of Belarus. And then the state channels announced that it might have been basically the attack coming from Ukraine, and thus basically preparing the population for possible military response of Belarus to this attack. And also there are now rumors that, well, not rumors, but I think the conscription of those who were in reserves, I think it is beginning now in Belarus, and that means that quite possibly Belarus is now on standby. Belarusian regime is now on standby in terms of getting involved deeper and deeper into the war with Ukraine. So it's interesting to see how Lukashenko and the regime are using every opportunity in order to justify their actions in Ukraine, and threatening this way their own security and stability.
Does anybody else have a comment on that? Or if not, we'll move to the next question.
Just really quickly. Actually, we all keep hearing that Belarus might get involved directly into the war, but I would like to slightly challenge this point and actually question to what extent Putin is now very interested in Belarusian direct involvement in the war. We all know that he is now succeeding in taking Luhansk and Donetsk. So does he really need the Belarusian army right now? I would argue that he's saving this option as a measure of last resort, because I think Putin is aware of the negative opinion polls in Belarus. He's also aware of the moods among Belarusian elites, which are also negative. So I would like to say that I guess he's just keeping this option open. He makes sure that when the moment comes, when the radical moment comes, if Russia starts losing in the war, Lukashenko would be ready to intervene, but possibly right now, at this very moment, he is not interested to develop this scenario.
Okay, well, our next question touches on exactly that. It's from Emily Kuch at Freedom House, referencing your comment, Ella, that there's opposition among the Belarusian military to greater participation in the war. Is there a possibility of elite defection and regime collapse? Were Lukashenko to decide to involve Belarus's military in the conflict? Might that be what Putin makes Putin hesitant to involve the Belarusian military?
Yeah, well, as we all know, Belarus, like any other authoritarian state, it's largely a black box. So it's very difficult to understand what's going on inside it. But from what we can see from the information available in the open space, and some things that I have already mentioned in my opening statements, such as resignations of officials, which happened a few months ago, and also these recent developments at the beginning of July with this open letter addressed to Lukashenko. I think these are the indicators that elites are not happy about Belarus being directly involved in the war. So Lukashenko is cautious about making this step in this direction. And I think, once again, just to reiterate the point, political instability in Belarus is the last thing that Putin needs right now, because he already has a lot on his plate to deal with. So I think both he and Lukashenko, they will just engage in this escalating rhetoric, which they are both very good at, but they will postpone taking decision until so to say the last moment.
All right, we have about 15 minutes left in our conversation. I see you have a hand up, so please.
Yeah, let me jump in very quickly here about this letter, open letter. Kind of, it has been confirmed that this is fake, so I will not count on this. And it is difficult to imagine after 2020 that elites, bureaucrats, or any kind of managers of all levels would be willing to openly speak against Lukashenko, especially with Russian troops on the ground, especially when people are arrested for a like in Facebook and social media. So until now, the elites, the state apparatus has shown rather monolithic nature. After 2020 elections, we have seen a huge exodus of great specialists from the foreign service, from some other ministers, but not so much after the war started. And this is because of the culture of fear that has been installed in Belarus after 2020. The repressions have been running high, and it's very difficult for people to make this step to break out of the equation with Lukashenko.
Okay. Well, because it's a monolith does not necessarily mean that it's not a brittle monolith. So it's difficult to know. That's what makes analyzing situations like this so problematic, and that's why we're so fortunate to be joined by the four of you today. We have a question from Jean Mayer at American University. What is the possibility of a civil war breaking out in Belarus? And that is a question to any of the panelists.
I can start. I don't think this is possible in the next visible future. Of course, when if the war in Ukraine will be escalating, and the war will also touch Belarus directly, and the European Union, NATO countries will be involved. And of course, there are if that could lead to possible civil conflict inside of Belarus. Right now, it's almost impossible because Belarusians, of course, they are very anti-war in their assets. Even if Lukashenko and Putin will try to provoke Belarusians for having open conflict with some neighbors, it's very unlikely that Belarusians themselves who are in the country, they will organize in the groups and will fight either neighbors or some other groups inside of Belarus. I really believe that this peace-making approach and character of Belarusian society, it will help us to prevent the escalation, will help us to avoid possible civil conflict inside of Belarus, and even more, it will help to stabilize the region. But it will be possible only in case of dismantling Lukashenko's dictatorship. Not right now, because Lukashenko is basically the main provocator who is escalating, who is irritating the society, who is polarizing society. When Lukashenko will be out, I think Belarusian consolidation within Belarusian society will happen very soon. And also about opinion polls. Right now, only according to the last survey, we saw that only 7% of Belarusians are supporting the idea of unification with Russia. And I think it's also the number which is exaggerated. I think it's much smaller number. So Belarusians, of course, they want to be friends with Russia. There is some sentiment, nostalgia among some groups of population, but they want to live in a separate homes. This is something what the world must understand. Belarus is not Russia, and the feeling, attitude to war, perception of the world, and perception of Ukraine is very different in our country.
Okay, we have a question from George Kroll, former U.S. ambassador to Belarus, and he wants to know what the speakers think about the virtual closure of the U.S. embassy and other foreign embassies in Minsk. And he also asks, do you think Russia would invade Belarus if in the future Moscow thinks Belarus might be trying to move out of Russia's orbit?
If I can start here, and it's a pleasure to have a question from Ambassador Kroll. I used to be in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs when he was ambassador in Belarus, and he has an excellent reputation ever since. So I would start with the last point, with the possible invasion of Russia in Belarus. We have been rather vocal about the threat to independence and sovereignty from Lukashenka ever since the protest started, knowing that he is willing to trade in sovereignty and independence of our country in return for political favors and support from Putin. And we have called for the Western countries to prove in practice their commitment for independent and sovereign Belarus, to make their policy to sort of as a deterrent against any such moves from Russia, is that no deals, international agreements signed by Lukashenko after 2020 would be recognized by the international community. Sort of the Venice Declaration 2022, kind of not to wait until it happens, as it happened with the Baltic states in 1940, but to do this preventively and to make sure that nobody is playing such games. Until now, this hasn't happened, and I have a feeling that in 2021, Russia, Putin and Lukashenko saw this space that was unchallenged, and they made some moves that brought Belarus much closer under the control of Russia. As far as the closure of the embassy in Minsk is concerned, we have to be realistic that this is not an actual closure. It's just the staff from the embassy was moved to Vilnius because of the war. But we cannot rule out that these diplomats might return to Minsk at some point in the future, because this is the essence of the American diplomacy, kind of boots on the ground, ears and eyes there. So this might happen, and we have to make sure that kind of the response to this is not that this is the recognition of Lukashenko, but this is because American diplomats need to be on the ground to do their work effectively.
Can I jump in here to add to Valery? So we had a great support from U.S. presence in Vilnius. Ambassador Julie Fisher bridged us to Washington, and we managed to build a trustful and efficient collaboration. Right now, Julie Fisher left her position, and we are waiting for the new special envoy appointed to Vilnius. And let us emphasize that it's important that envoy works from Vilnius. To be nearby, to work with us. And it's also the right message to Belarusian society and to international community that the real representatives of democratic Belarus, they are there in Vilnius.
Okay, I will ask one final question, and then I think we should go around the panel one last time for any concluding remark. So my final question is, what was the reaction in Belarus to Russian troops holding the territory of the Chernobyl plant and their, shall we say, irresponsible actions while at Chernobyl, including digging trenches and what have you? Was it even covered in Belarus? What was the reaction? if anyone knows.
I'll probably start here. We actually had a webinar with the office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and Lopsec Institute actually precisely on this point when the situation happened. And we produced a policy brief reflecting our conclusions on that. That was under the Oxford Belarus Observatory. So for anyone interested, please do go visit the website and find it there. But just to say that actually once again, what happened then, and it's not just the occupation of Chernobyl and the threat, but also the looting of Chernobyl station. It was utterly unprecedented and clearly violating and breaking all possible conventions and laws. And in that sense, I think the major kind of conclusion of that situation was that actually we've run out, as I mentioned at the beginning, we don't really have relevant means or leverage in order to stay in control of these kind of situations. You know, there was a Venice Convention, there were Paris Treaty, and so many other things that clearly stated that places of nuclear or nuclear sites, they even in the times of war, they should not be used either as a threat or in any way, in any form or action as a leverage opportunity. And yet these laws, which were signed and put in place, these conventions, they were still violated. So I think we should just ask ourselves a question that how much leverage, international leverage, we actually have over these kind of actions and what the international community can do in this regard, because I personally think we're now at that stage when there is we continue escalating the situation, and at the same time we don't really have any means to one way or another stop it from happening.
Thank you. Valery, I know you need to leave us a little bit early, so I will ask you to please offer your final conclusion thought first.
Thank you. Thank you very much again for organizing this discussion. I would probably like to echo what Franak said, that Belarus is part of the solution in this regard. This war must be resolved with the resolution of the crisis in Belarus. Belarus of Lukashenka has started this war, and the resolution of the crisis in Belarus might stop this war. And this timing right now is so important to start the conversation of how the regional security would look like after the war is over. Sooner or later it will. Putin is not going to win this war, not against the whole world, against him. That's why it's important to start the conversation now. What would be the regional security arrangement, but also what would be the bilateral relations between Belarus and Ukraine, and not to repeat the same pattern when people are very close of two countries, but the states are very suspicious of each other. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Valery. Franak, would you care to offer your final thoughts? And please, we have a minute each before we conclude today. I think we might have lost the signal. So while he tries to come back, Elena, the floor is yours for a final thought. Or I was going to come to you last, but if you want to go now, please do.
Oh, yeah, just before I pass to my concluding statements, really quickly, I would like to comment on Ambassador Kroll's question about the possibility of military intervention in Belarus. I think it's highly unlikely, and it's possible only if Lukashenko tries to sort of jump off the ship. And we all know this is not really possible. He cannot start, flirting with the West as he used to do during his previous presidential tenures. And in my concluding, basically what Russia will try to realize is this soft mode of occupation of Belarus through deeper integration, possibly introduction of common currency and later common supranational bodies. But in my concluding statement, I would just like to quickly say that I think there is a lot of demand for political change in Belarus now. It has been highly amplified by the war in Ukraine. And I think it's very important not to lose this momentum, not to let Lukashenko drag Belarus into this massacre. And just to keep Belarus in the international spotlight.
Okay. Great. Franek, we lost you a moment.
I'm back. Yes.
Your final thought, please.
It's very important to keep Belarus on the agenda. Its importance is much bigger than it seems. It's very important to distinguish the people and the regime because Belarus is not equal regime. And when we read in independent or in Western media sanctions on Belarus, not on Belarus, but on the regime, we should punish Belarus, not Belarus, but the regime. And the second advice is to distinguish Belarus and Russia. Because since Soviet time, perhaps, there is understanding that Belarus is like Russia. Belarusians are like Russians. It's not true. Belarus is the independent country with separate identity, with a separate worldview. And it's very important that the world realize this fact and will develop independent, comprehensive strategy and policy towards Belarus.
Thank you very much, Franek. Yelena, you have the last word.
Thank you. Famous. Okay. Just to say that actually, if anything, I totally agree with Franek. It is important to keep people separate from understanding regime in Belarus. That's simply because what we are seeing that there is a lot of effort now clearly in place to support Ukrainians, displaced Ukrainians. But if you think about it, all those Belarusians who had to flee from Belarus in 2020, many of them actually ended up in Ukraine, and now they're being displaced in Europe. And there is not really much tension in that sense given, or the same level of attention to Belarusians who actually in that way appear to be double refugees. And I would suggest that it's not just important to keep Belarus in the spotlight. I think it is important to keep pressure on the regime. And we can see that sanctions that have been put in place are now beginning to show fruit. So let's just see how what further actions could be taken in order to ensure that the pressure is on. And when the pressure is on, obviously the edifice of authoritarianism is likely to crack sooner.
Well, on that note, and a great note to conclude on, I want to thank our audience for joining us today. And thanks to our speakers for such an insightful conversation about Belarus, the Russian war in Ukraine, and the importance of distinguishing between the Belarusian people and its government. It's advice that and a strategy that Reagan employed in the depths of the Cold War. And I think it's one that has very much a great deal of relevance today. Please, to our audience, visit our website if you'd like to stay up to date on our upcoming events and publications, as well as our podcast, Canon X, and the Russia File. And until we meet again, thank you again for attending today's event. Thank you again to our speakers. And this wraps up today's session. Goodbye to you all.